Welcome to the latest episode of the Busy Aviation Podcast. In this episode I talk with Chris Taylor, whose background is in military test flying, and how he tests all different types of general aviation aircraft. There's some great stories and some really interesting information. Let's get started. Hi Chris, welcome to the Busy Aviation Podcast. It's great to have you on the show, our first ever test pilot. Let's start by finding out a little bit more about your career in aviation.
Well, hi Chris, it's really nice to see you and chat to you at long last after emails and phone calls and bits and pieces. So I think we share a little bit of a common background in that I was in the military as well. Ironically, I was talking to somebody the other day and I was saying that I was mad keen to be a pilot ever since I can remember, and I think it boils down to the fact that my parents took me to a place called Aberfraw on the island of Anglesey every summer when I was a toddler. And it turns out that Aberfraw is base leg for RAF Valley, and almost certainly I had yellow gnats and yellow whirlwinds turning final over my head, summer after summer. And there's a picture of me actually outside the wire of Valley. There were some silver chrome lightnings in the background. So I think that sowed the seed, I think, if I'm honest. That and the fact that my dad was a clerk to two fighter squadrons in World War II. So I didn't realise this until downloading his war record relatively recently. But back then, in the 30s and 40s, RAF squadrons only consisted of pilots and one sergeant fitter, and a corporal clerk. All the engineering support came from the airfield. It didn't come from the squadron, right. Unlike today. So, and my dad was the clerk. He was the corporal clerk. So he was the guy almost certainly writing the letters home when pilots didn't come back. He was the guy that wrote the squadron record book. He was with Treble 2 Squadron for a while. Almost certainly had a nervous breakdown, and then he joined 65 Squadron, which was flying Mustang 3s and 4s, and they were used in the ground support role immediately after D-Day. They flew into France. They were working on all these short strips. They supported the Arnhem Market Garden campaign. And my dad's stories from that time were absolutely priceless. Very funny, entertaining, and all his mates are pilots. So he was very encouraging of my aviation interest, should I say. And having seen planes flying overhead, guess what? I was reading Biggles. I was reading all those W.E. Johns stories. I had balsa aeroplanes that I built all winter and crashed all summer. I made the Airfix models like we all did back then. Half a crown, pocket money, hanging from the ceiling of the bedroom in the evening. So that was the background. That was my kind of early years in childhood. When I became a teenager, it was then starting to get a bit more real. Like what am I actually going to do for a living when I leave school or whatever? And I said this to somebody the other day. I know you're ex-Air Force, but
nothing wrong with that.
BEA and BOAC back then, predecessor to British Airways, and of course they just closed Hamble back then. So that was not an obvious route. So I was really looking at the three armed services. The Air Force did everything it could to deter me. The Royal Navy did everything it could to encourage me. I mean, time after time.
I don't think that's changed, actually.
So here's the start of a 10 example. So I was 16. I was coming up to GCSEs, O levels as we called them back in the day. The careers officer said, "What do you want to do, Taylor?" I said, "I want to be a pilot. Obviously, I want to join the Air Force, be a fighter pilot." Why not? And he rang up the Air Force and said, "I've got this guy, wants to come and visit an air station. Can you accommodate him?" "No, far too busy, can't do anything." "Okay, Taylor, what next?" "Well, Fleet Air on." And so, to the long story short, I went down to RNAS Culdrose in Cornwall, Helston, 10 days. As a 16-year-old, I had a free bar bill in the ward. No questions asked about my age. Every night, I'm in the wardroom, a couple of pints of lager, because that's what I drank back then. And the Navy flew me in everything they had. Every day I went flying. And back then, we had a lot of different types. So I was in a Sea Prince, I was in a Whirlwind, I was in a Hiller, everything. It was fantastic. And then when I was 17, I applied for a flying scholarship with the Air Force and with the Navy. Went to Biggin Hill, did all the aptitude tests, all that stuff. I get called in to see the squadron leader. He says, right, Taylor, good news and bad news. Bad news is the Air Force isn't going to give you a flying scholarship. Oh, that's not so good. The good news is go and see my mate next door who's in the Royal Navy, and the Navy gave me a flying scholarship. So at the age of 17, I was down at Ipswich flying Cessna 150s. Ipswich was a lovely little grass airfield before it got closed. I got my PPL out of that. My parents helped with a few extra flying hours. Then it's like, okay, I'd like to go to university, get an engineering degree, because I was already starting to think about being a test pilot. A bit pompous when I just got a PPL on Cessna 150s. If you might think, but there were some TV programs on at the time about test flying, and they're all quite exciting. So I thought, you never know, perhaps I should do engineering. And again, I applied to the Air Force and said, please can I have a cadetship? I'm now going to do this. I've now got a PPL. I've passed the aptitude tests. I'm a known quantity. And their response was, yes, you can have a cadetship. Yippee, great. As an engineering officer. And I go, well, I don't want to be an engineering officer. I want to be a pilot. I've passed my aptitude tests. I've got a PPL. And said, no. We've got lots of pilots. We need engineering officers. You're going to get an engineering degree, so be an engineer. And I said, no, thanks. He said, no, maybe a navigator. I said, no, sorry.
They try that on everyone.
So I know. So I turned the Air Force down, went to university. I then went to the University Air Squadron, because I hadn't yet joined the Navy. I gave them one last chance. And I said, look, this is me, desperate to be a pilot. And they said, I think you've considered the Royal Navy, haven't you? And I said, well, yeah, absolutely. I've considered everything. Little did I realise what rivalry there was between the senior and junior service. I shot myself in both feet by even hinting that I'd shown some interest in the Navy. Yeah, so that was the background as to, long story short, but I ended up joining the Navy on a cadetship. They paid me through the last 2 years at university. The downside of that was, as an aviator, was that the Navy's cadetships work for career officers, GL, full career commission, if we remember it right. So I was signing on for 16 years, and I had to be a ship driver first. That's the Navy view. It's a bit like the Army. A lot of their pilots came from the Royal Artillery.
Still do, yeah.
So back then, you had to join the Navy. If you wanted to be a career officer, you joined to drive ships, and then you subspecialised as a pilot. So that's what I did, which delayed me actually starting my flying training by a good couple of years. Which, pros and cons. Yeah. But I ran a car at university, and I managed to eat, which is probably I wouldn't have been able to do had I not. So anyway, that's how I got into flying. I got my Navy wings a little while after that, and back in 1983.
That's really interesting. And the way the routes into the military, have changed so much. I'm a little bit up close and personal with this, as my youngest son is going through it at the moment, and you've got to feel sorry for them, because you gave that example how you were taken to Culdrose for 10 days and looked after, and of course the opportunities are just not there for that anymore. It's all outsourced. Your fitness test is done by a private company, your medical is done by a private company. And you have very little engagement with the services before you get in. And that's even if you can get an application in. For example, at the moment, the Air Force is not recruiting at all, because the training system is just absolutely chock-a-block, clogged up, because we could for various reasons, but another whole podcast worth. But and it's such a shame when you hear a story like yourself, that such an interesting route into the military, and that start is just not there anymore. But still fascinating and amusing. Right. I don't know if the barbell. I mean, these days, can you imagine giving a 16-year-old a barbell in a wardroom? It
was amazing, absolutely, and we were treated well. We had a few of the midshipmen sort of stitched up probably, but they were only sort of 18, 19, so it was reasonably close to our ages, and they were told to sort of look after us and socialise with us. So it was quite a fun 10 days, and it concluded with the air show that was usually held in Culdrose in July, and that was when Art Royal was still just about hanging in there. So it was an amazing air show. The cloud base was 100 feet, and so we thought, this is the Fleet Air on for you. We thought, we're not going to see the jets. Little did we know. I mean, the Buccaneer air display with a 100-foot cloud base was phenomenal. And as it rolled, almost scraping its wingtip, it opened its bomb doors, and it said, and you'll see the words "Fly Navy" was the commentary. But what we saw was "Fixed Wing Lives" in bold letters in the bomb bay, as it literally scraped down the tarmac on its.
Luckily, a friend of mine was a Buccaneer pilot, and just before I left the Air Force, he'd become a Tornado pilot because all the Buccaneers had gone. But of course, very used to flying at 50 feet over the sea and lower. So I was very lucky that I got the back seat of a Tornado as my last trip in the Air Force, and he demonstrated to me how they used to fly the Buccaneer with a Tornado. And I was even as a helicopter pilot who's used to being next to the sea, I was seriously impressed. Yeah. So now you're in the Navy, and what was the first? Well, there was training, of course. What was the first operational type you got to fly?
So I was very lucky. I mean, the type that I wanted to fly, right from investigating the Fleet Air Arm in those early days, was the Wasp. That's the helicopter I wanted to fly. And I was lucky enough. One of my bits of naval training was on a Tribal class frigate that was equipped with a Wasp, so I got a chance to meet the pilot and see what he did. The Wasp was one of those incredible multi-role aircraft. There was nothing the Wasp didn't try and turn its hand to, basically. And the good thing as well was it was a single pilot helicopter. So whereas when I got my wings and came off the training at Cold Rose, my mates basically went either to fly the Sea King, a couple went to the Wessex, but I went to the Wasp. So immediately I was flying on my own, and I was treated as a grown-up. And very quickly, I did a sort of little bit of a session understudying another pilot, but within months I was let loose on my own. And then you are the pilot on the ship. You are, and that means you are the warfare officer who's knowledgeable about aviation. Quite often you have the most capable weapon systems on the ship, ironically. So you were sort of integrated part of the warfare team. It was a lot of fun, and you got the mail, and you took people ashore, when they wanted to go ashore. And if somebody wasn't well, you flew them to hospital. And if somebody fell in the sea, you picked them out of the sea, as well as flying around with torpedoes and depth charges and missiles and all that good stuff. And the Wasp was already very old. I mean, by the time I joined the Wasp squadron, everything was, it was in its demise as a type. But there was good news and bad news to that. I mean, that meant there were very few ab initio Wasp pilots that followed me. There were only 2 other Wasp pilots that followed me into that particular clan, if you like. It was a challenging aircraft. So it was a very good tool for learning the trade of being an operational helicopter pilot. It didn't have an awful lot of power. It was incredibly limited on range and endurance. It was, almost always close to being over-torqued. You're always pulling all the power the aircraft had just to do anything. To give you one example of that.
Yes, I have.
Have you read the book Chicken Hawk? Probably you have as a helicopter pilot. Yeah. So I mean, I was fueling. My ship was based in Rosyth. The helicopter was based in Portland. So we would disembark and end up at Portland. One Sunday, I had to embark on my ship. So I'm flying through all those RAF airfields that were still open back then. And thankfully, I had an endurance of 1 hour, so I had a range of 90 miles. Right? So I could, and thankfully, there was just an Air Force station every 90 miles back then. I mean, there isn't now. And I flew into one of them. I can't remember which one it was now. And they said, "Oh, the airfield's closed." But I said, "I've booked fuel on the radio." They said, "Okay, that's fine. You can land in the fueling depot itself." So I landed in there and topped up with fuel. And the fueling depot was surrounded by this 20-foot high chain
I know
fence.
What's coming next.
And it was a wire fence. And I'd gone from being, at about 4,800 pounds weight to being 5,500 pounds weight. My performance had gone from I had some to I had none, and I couldn't get over the fence. I mean, how embarrassing that! It's a Sunday afternoon. I'm sitting there in the hover. Every time I pull power to try and get out of the compound, I haven't got enough power to get out. So, in the end, it was one of those chicken hawk things where I sort of reversed into the corner, accelerated across the diagonal, used all that extra lift you and I know we get from translational lift, and then just about hopped over the fence at the far end and carried on to recite. So that was the Wasp. It was a brilliant. It was a very steep learning curve.
In fact, I just remember the Wasp when at the end of the Falklands. At the time, my father had a boat on the Medway, and I can't remember which ship it was. It was one of, I think it was one of the survey vessels that had been down there. Was it Endurance? Yeah.
Heckler or Hydra.
Yeah, and I remember it coming back up the Medway,
Endurance,
and I've still got photographs now. Proper, not digital photographs, but prints of about 4 Wasps. Yeah. I think on either side of it, leading it back up. And of course, there was lots of a flotilla of small boats around. Quite something, because it's got it's 4 wheels, isn't it? The Wasp, is it? Yeah.
It's 4 wheels. Yeah, and you could pivot them on board the ship. You could pivot them at 45 degrees, so you could spot turn on the deck. You could rotate the helicopter using the tail rotor on the deck, so you could take off into wind.
It sounds like you needed to take off into wind as well.
Oh, you needed all the wind you could get to get airborne.
It's quite something, yeah. And so what did that lead to? So that you were talking about that as the demise, it was on its way out.
Yeah, so, I flew the Wasp for 3 years, over 1,000 deck landings in the Wasp, about 800, 900 flying hours. But unfortunately, the Wasp went to scrap. I mean, the Wasp... was at the end of its operational life, really. The obvious successor for me to move on to was the Lynx helicopter, which was a joint Westland Aerospatiale project. And it was like the Wasp on steroids in many respects. It was twin engine. It had a much better payload, much better endurance, could fly much faster. Its weapon systems were much more capable. It still had the same torpedoes, but it now had a sea-skewer missile, which was actually an incredibly useful missile for its timing. And it had a radar. It was only a 180-degree scanning radar, but it was a very good radar. I mean, you were able to pick up sort of periscopes from submarines and things like that with it. So. That was useful operationally, but also incredibly useful for finding the ship. One of the biggest challenges in the Wasp was you'd get airborne, you got an hour's worth of gas if you were lucky. Yeah. The ship suddenly went off in the wrong direction. You go back.
Well, we always know, and
it wasn't.
Royal Navy ships are never where they say they are. That's the law.
Never where they say they are. So in the Wasp, that led to a lot of very scary moments. Trying to find the ship. Literally running on fumes, as it were. The Lynx, when we turn up and the ship wasn't there, at least we could put the radar on and go, right, well, there's a ship there. Maybe that's it. Maybe that's not. And we could eventually find our own mother who'd gone off in the wrong direction invariably. So, but yeah, Lynx was great fun. And as helicopters go, it had a semi-rigid rotor head, so it was effectively an aerobatic helicopter. The Army, as we know, used to turn them upside down for air displays, and it had a very good undercarriage. So if you were going to, I've said this to a lot of people, if you're going to land on the back of a ship, be in a Lynx. There's no doubt in my mind the Lynx, and possibly the Wildcat as a successor, is the most capable ship operator.
Did it have harpoon in those days? Or? Yeah,
it did. It did have harpoon. Yeah. Of course, the Wasp didn't. We just had guys that ran out with nylon lashings and tried to. To give you an example of when I was training to fly the Wasp, I was training to fly the Wasp. I ditched in the first day, so I lost the second day because they had to find me another helicopter. Then I went out the third day. Then they changed ship on me, and we went to a Tribal class frigate. I'm doing my emergency trip at night. I landed on this Tribal class frigate. The ship rolled, and the only thing that stopped me sliding over the side was the wooden beading around the side of the deck. That was literally the only thing that stopped me rolling over the side. The Lynx had this harpoon, which was like a latch. You could fire it down onto a grid, and it would hold you on the deck temporarily whilst the blokes came out with their lashings and tied it down properly. So it was very capable.
As a crab, as an RAF pilot, fortunately flying the Sea King, I did a fair few landings on the back of Royal Navy ships, which is it was quite exciting actually. And down in the Falklands, being SAR guys, until the infamous Chinook incident on Ocean, where an RAF pilot managed to clatter into the back of it, we just used to pitch up and do it. We'd read the book and go and do it, and it was quite good fun. Which and as you say, you get on deck. There's no harpoon on the Sea King, so you just wait for the guys to run in with the lashings. When I left the Air Force, I went to fly the Bolko 105 doing lighthouse support on skids on metal decks with no nets. And I thought I'd seen some interesting times in the Sea King on the back of frigates. Nothing compared to what happened on a Bolko with metal to metal. But that's for another time. But and we didn't used to tie it down unless you were getting out of it to leave it for the night. Which was really very interesting. Right. But there you go. So the Lynx, and I've never flown the Lynx, so it sounds really interesting. Also, still the fastest helicopter in the world. Yeah, it
still holds the airspeed record. Yes, it clocked at 400 kilometres an hour in a modified version of it. It was a sort of modified Air Force Army version with skids, and they managed to get some extra thrust out the engines and things like that. So yes,
so was that I can't remember. You said how long did you stay in the Navy for, Chris? Was this towards the? Oh, there you go. So there's more to come. So
long time.
Was it for the Lynx and then moved on to test pilot flying, or was there something in between?
Yeah, well, yes. I mean, I did sort of. I was on 3 separate flights in the Wasp. I was on a Lynx flight for a couple of years. Went down to the Falklands. Did all sorts of interesting stuff. I wanted to become an instructor, so I managed to go into the qualified helicopter instructor course at RAF Shawbury. Did that, and then went back to teaching on the Lynx. Taught on the Lynx for a couple of years, and by then, and this might sound, we obviously share that sort of overlap of helicopters. I'd done everything I could legally do in a helicopter, and more. I'd flown them every which way in all sorts of weathers, all sorts of conditions, and clearly, I think as time's gone on, I realise I've got a low attention span.
Well, you're a pilot.
I get bored. Eventually, I get bored. I'm a pilot. I get bored. I've done that, seen that, got the T-shirt. What's next? What's the next challenge? And so the initial thing was, the initial sort of idea was, I was a frustrated fixed wing pilot. Obviously, I'd got a PPL. I'd flown aeroplanes. I'd flown Bulldogs as part of my training. What about the Sea Harrier? Looked at what the Sea Harrier was doing. There just weren't any vacancies back then. I mean, the Sea Harrier fleet was very small. They had a lot of ex Phantom pilots, Buccaneer pilots still. We're taking very few ab initio pilots. We did have a Navy course called the SMAC 309, is where when you went to Yeovilton and flew the Hunter. And with hindsight, I wish I'd done it just to fly the Hunter for 30 hours, even if there hadn't been a Harrier slot at the end of it. But I looked at the job and everything else, and I thought, not sure. Meanwhile, ironically, one of my chums on the Lynx Training Squadron had been in touch with the Royal Air Force.
Of course.
The Air Force keeps cropping up. And it turns out the Royal Air Force had a specific office in Whitehall to steal pilots from other people. I mean, I think
they called it poaching.
Just exactly what it was.
Stealing.
Poaching, poaching sounds a bit better than stealing, doesn't it? But that's exactly what it was. So this guy was there. I spoke to him lots. He was trying to get people from Australia, New Zealand, the other sort of Western countries, and he was also poaching them from the other armed services. And one of my colleagues had done a lot of the groundwork. And back then, it turns out the Air Force was short of QFIs, flying instructors. As qualified helicopter instructors, we could be fast-tracked the QFI course, the flying instructor course for airplanes, and so it was a case of, right, come to us. You'll get an Air Force commission. We'll send you to Cranwell, 4-week course at Cranwell. Learn you to teach, to march properly, salute properly in the Air Force manner. Then we're going to send me on a fast jet refresher course, flying jet provosts around Yorkshire for 30 hours. That sounded a lot of fun. Then I was going to learn how to fly with Tucano. Then I was going to do the QFI course. Then I was going to be a QFI on the Hawk.
Yeah.
And then, who knows? It was going to be then all the options are open. And the 4 of us set off to do it. And the other 3 guys went through. Sadly for me, my wife was taken seriously ill just at that time. Life is like that, isn't it? And I just spent a huge amount of energy and effort sort of getting this all sorted out. And we actually went to see my wife's consultant, and I said to the guy, look, I'm just about to join the Air Force, and I'm going to do 4 weeks in Lincolnshire, another 6 weeks in Yorkshire, then I'm going to go down here and over there, and so on and so forth. And he said, no, you're not.
Right.
I mean, he just laughed at me. He just said, no, your wife needs to be, within a 30-mile radius of this hospital, and you're not going anywhere. Okay, fine. And again, I have to say, the Royal Navy, bless their cotton socks, all the way through this process, even though I'd handed in my 18 months' notice, I'd done the PVR thing, so I really kind of reneged on my contract with the Navy. The guys in London kept ringing me up every week and saying, have you changed your mind yet? Have you changed your mind yet? And I got within a week of leaving the Navy and joining the Air Force, and this guy rang me again. And I said, do you know what? As chance would have it, something has cropped up. And I would love to stay in the Royal Navy on condition that you give me this specific job. And by then, I'd worked out that, I couldn't join the Air Force. But as I mentioned earlier, way back when, having just got my PPL, I'd already started to get interested in being a test pilot. And the thing that had put me off was a program I saw in the 80s, which featured a lot of the guys that became my colleagues, who all seemed to be having a really tough time.
Yeah, I think I've got the book on my bookshelf. I'm looking over here. I think I've got the book on my... Yeah,
it's called Test Pilot. It's called Test Pilot, which is another reason why I didn't want to call my book Test Pilot, because that book is on my shelf as well. And absolutely. If you read the book and if you saw the program, you think, gosh, they're all working till midnight. I can't do that. I'm up there. I'm not good enough to do that. But what I said to the Navy was, okay, what I'd really like to do is be the officer commanding the Link simulator. So we had a simulator at Portland. We have 3 simulators teaching Link's crews. And it actually worked very well. I ran the simulator. I was reflecting on it recently. When I got there, morale was low. Everyone was cheesed off. 2 or 3 years later, we were, highly respected. We were training everybody in the Links world. We were flying on all 3 squadrons, instructing all 3 squadrons. So I didn't stop flying. And the good news was I could manage my time better. So the simulator ran sort of 12, 15 hours a day. So I was trying to do a lot of babysitting for our young children at the time because my wife was still ill. So I could say, right, I'll drop the kids off, get into the simulator, then I can pop home, pick them up, then I can do a late shift, and I did all that, a lot of night flying as well. And the other good news with that was I got to know my own aircraft, the Lynx, incredibly well, and also I could use some of the time to prepare for the examinations to be a test pilot. And I did lots of other stuff. In fact, I went to America, I did some stuff out there. I learned to fly some different helicopters out there. I went and visited NASA. I rang up NASA and said, please can I come and visit? And I spent a day at Houston with the head of their training. The head of astronaut training hosted me for a day. I flew the Space Shuttle simulator. Amazing. And it's just like Chris Taylor from somewhere in the Royal Navy. I don't think they knew who I was.
I always used to put NASA on my what you call it, draft and
amazing.
posting. You used to have a choice of 3 posts. Well, we would call it. At the time, I desperately wanted to go fixed wing, or back to fixed wing, but I was the third one. I always used to put NASA. I just used to put NASA. I didn't put anything on it, because I couldn't really think of anything else. And I thought one day you never know,
Why not? Well, you never know. Anyway, yes. So and then I formally applied, went for the interviews, I mean, getting into ETPS, particularly in the Navy, was very difficult. There was only one slot every year. And there was a lot of competition. And in the end, the competition was whittled down to a short list of 2 of us. The other guy had flown fixed wing, he'd flown some jet time, and I thought, I'm really up against it. He's bound to be chosen over me. But for reasons various, I was in pole position and offered the slot.
And so this is now ETPS. So this is, I think, one of the things that, obviously from the flavour of it, which we'll come to in a moment, your book, you started flying fixed wing as well. So you're testing fixed wing aircraft as well as helicopters. How is that transition? How is that done in ETPS? Yeah. Because as you said, you didn't have jet time, or I think you're going to say they put you in it and send you off.
Well, no. I mean, I'll be honest. One of the big disappointments in getting to ETPS was just great. It was great, and ETPS, and in fairness, the other test pilot schools around the world. I mean, it is just a fantastic experience, and I get phoned up every now and again by people that want to be test pilots, but the cost of these courses, is just eye-watering. So, the average guy who's sitting there right now flying his C-42 Icarus, thinking he'll want to be a test pilot, he's on such a steep trajectory to get close to it. Right? But the military send people there, so that was a good start. But the course itself is incredibly hard work, and the course, I hadn't realised it until I started, but it is very distinctly split between rotary and fixed wing. There is a really big divide. You literally have a handful of lessons during ground school before, apart from social events, you rarely mix and mingle with your fellow students from the other side of the house at all. So I got a go in a Hawk, I got a go in what else did I fly? A couple of other things, BSC 111. But really, I graduated after that year, and I did well. I mean, I got the prize for the best helicopter pilot on the course, which is great. And but really, my fixed wing credibility, experience, had not grown at all. But I had become a helicopter pilot, which is no bad thing. I mean, that was quite a good start. But the job I had wanted to get, and the reason I specifically targeted this year to do the training, was that once every 3 years there was one place to join what was called experimental flying squadron. So back in those days, RAE Bedford and RAE Farnborough were 2 big MOD airfields that did all our research and development flying. So all the flying bedstead stuff was done at Bedford. A lot of the nitrogen goggle research, the infrared camera research was all done at Farnborough. So I joined a squadron which, as it happened, was just moved to Boscombe Down as I joined it. So Bedford closed, Farnborough semi-closed, and the aircraft fleet all came to Boscombe Down. And we had a dozen test pilots, actually maybe only about 8 or 9 of us sometimes, flying a whole bunch of different aircraft. So to give you an idea, we had the Wessex. I was the project pilot for the Wessex. We had a couple of Sea Kings. We had a couple of Lynx. So that was the helicopter fleet. We also had access to the Scout and the Gazelle and bits and pieces. But we had several Hunters. We had a couple of Jaguars. We had Andovers, HS748s. We had BAC 111s. And we didn't have enough pilots. So everybody's co-pilot was somebody from another discipline. So when I flew the Sea King, and as you know with the Sea King, you always needed somebody to work the throttles in an emergency. It was usually a phantom pilot sitting in the other seat who loved it because I let him do all the flying. How cool I just sat there and took notes and did all the admin. And the F4 guy flew me around. I nearly crashed me at Fair Oaks. That's another story. But that was a lot of fun. Or I'd be flying the Andover, or I'd be flying with my fixed wing mate in the Jaguar, or whatever. A massive amount of fun. So I did that for a couple of years. The other thing I did whilst I was there, I mean, I think you mentioned just before we sort of went live that you had
a tornado,
one of my
because they crashed. The Air Force crashed all the 2-seat Buccaneers, didn't they? So there was none left. Yeah, they used to use a Hunter.
Oh, did they?
They used to use a Hunter with a which I also very luckily I held on a Buccaneer squadron. at one stage for about 6 months, and I got, I don't know, probably must be 20 or 30 hours of hunter flying, because they used to go and do their their staff continuation training, because you couldn't do it in the Buccaneer. They used to do it in the Hunter, and in the right hand seat of the Hunter, it had a Buccaneer cockpit. Anyway,
I've flown with that Hunter. I've flown one of those Hunters at Exeter. Exactly, T8 Hunter, Buccaneers,
a Ford Zephyr, Speedo.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it was an incredible cockpit. I must admit, I thoroughly enjoyed that, the glimpse of what I'd missed, really. But yeah, this mate of mine, he was flying Hawks. The Hawk was used until relatively recently to support the naval ship workup exercises. So Hawks would pretend to be either Hawks and jets, or they pretend to be missiles launched off things. So again, it was, come and fly a Hawk, and we'll beat ships up at 30 feet over the sea at 400 knots. So guess what? I found a bit of spare time to do that every now and again. So because I had all the gear, I was ejection seat trained. I had all the the G trousers and stuff like that. So during that 2 years, I built up a reasonable amount of experience on how the other half lives. I mean, I got a lot of different fixed wing experience. Then the Navy guy, the appointer, I mean, this is all a very long story. In my second book, I explained the story about how all the jobs fall out. But at one point, the Navy wanted to stop me being a test pilot and send me off to do something else. But at the end of the 2 years, they said, actually, we're short of a tutor back at ETPS. I had a mate who was also in the Navy. There were two jobs. One was at Patuxent River, one was at Boston Down. We flipped the coin, and actually what we did was talk to our wives because it was really our wives who decided. And actually, my wife wanted to stay in the UK. His wife wanted to go to the States, so that worked out really well. And I joined Boston Down ETPS again as an instructor now. And I have to say, in that first year was incredibly challenging. I had my first Mayday, flame out in a Hawk at 40-odd thousand feet. Crashed the Scout helicopter through complete incompetence. I learned how to fly the BAC 111 as a proper pilot. I qualified flying the Bassett, but my first ever landing was only on one engine because that engine failed. So it was an incredible year. But also during that year, I had to relearn all the stuff I thought I'd learned as a student. And it turns out I hadn't really learned a great deal. It's like the medics have this sort of see one, do one, teach one thing. And certainly it's the teaching of a topic, isn't it, that makes it really come home. So I did that for a while. I did actually 4 years of teaching helicopter pilots and helicopter flight test engineers how to do flight tests. That was a lot of fun. Then at the end of that period, yet again, I was umming what to do. The Navy at that point had run out of steam on the ladder of trying to encourage me to stay in. And they were going to send me back to the Lynx simulator, would you believe, after 4 years, 7 years as a test pilot at that point. So I said, no thanks, left the Navy and was recruited by ETPS to run all their short course training. And as a result of that, the boss of the squadron then, very entrepreneurial guy, said, and you will need to teach fiction. Because, it's just you. You are the test pilot teaching flight tests. And you need to design courses and so on and so forth. So in my first year in that job, I was sent off to 45 Squadron, which was the multi-engine training squadron, which you'll remember. Learned how to fly the Jetstream, which was good fun. And then on the strength of that, qualified on the Jetstream aircraft, which Cranfield University operated. So I became a pilot for that aeroplane. And we were going to use that extensively to do some short course stuff. In the end, it sort of petered out. But as a result of that, then obviously that kind of, that was my first stepping stone to be able to say to my military colleagues, do you know what? I am an aeroplane pilot now. I've come out of 45 Squadron as a qualified Air Force multi-engine pilot.
No.
You can't not be that. They don't let you leave without having done all the check rides and proved you can do it. And I learned how to teach fixed-wing flight tests. We used the Bassett aeroplane, which had a variable stability system. So I was teaching F-16 and Harrier pilots how to do fixed-wing flight tests within a few weeks. I was teaching multi-engine guys how to do VMCG, VMCA testing, and I did 3 years of that. So I went from being a helicopter pilot to being a helicopter test pilot to then being a tutor for helicopters and then being a tutor for aeroplanes. And then the final kind of stepping stone was after 3 years, I got very frustrated with the situation I was in for a variety of reasons, and the CEA wanted a fixed-wing test pilot.
Yeah.
And I applied and I got the job. So all of a sudden, I was now a fixed-wing test pilot. And I said, can I do some helicopter flying? And they said, no, don't do any helicopter flying. Not right now. We want you to be an aeroplane test pilot. Unbeknownst to me, my boss at the interview noted exactly what I'd said. As soon as the interview was complete, he went rushing around the whole building saying, this is buy one, get one free. He wants to do helicopters as well as aeroplanes. And it wasn't that long before I found myself doing both.
Blimey.
But that's how I became a fixed.
It really is some story, and it's fascinating as well. And you've had, it's some career. It really is. And I know, I don't want to give too much away, because obviously a lot of this, is this in the first book, second book?
Yeah, so I've written a book. I've actually written 2 books. The first book was published only about 4 or 5 weeks ago, and I've written a second book, which is at the publishers waiting their approval. So what I did was, for a bunch of reasons, it just crossed my mind that I'd reached an age. I turned 60 a few years ago, 4 years ago, and when my dad turned 60, he had a stroke. So all those fantastic stories he had, here's one of his best stories. He says to his mates on 65 Squadron, Brussels has been liberated, let's go in and get pissed. They all pile into a Jeep, about 6 of them on a Jeep. They go into Brussels, have a slap-up meal, get completely shit-faced because they were going to die the following day. As they're driving out of Brussels, there's blokes with grey uniforms standing on the street corners. Yeah. And they're going, what the hell is it? Well, it turns out Brussels wasn't liberated. The Germans still held Brussels. And like all these things in war, I think all these German soldiers were so staggered to see a bunch of completely pissed blokes, whistling past at 60 miles an hour in a Jeep. They didn't have time to shoot them. Amazing. Yeah. And he had loads of stories like that. But he had a stroke when he was 60. All of those stories got lost to us as children. And I thought, do you know what? I've got four grandkids. And I never know what's around the corner. None of us do, I guess. So I thought, do you know what? I ought to write some stuff down. And during lockdown, I thought, if my job was a little bit quieter, so I thought, if I can't find the time to do it now, perhaps I never will. And I like probably a lot of people. I took advice from people who have written books, and they said, well, you just got to try. If you're going to write a book, we can't tell you how to write a book. We don't know what your style is going to be like, whether you can string 2 words together or not, whatever. So I just started bashing away on the keyboard. I got a whole bunch of pilot books on my shelf, some of which are incredibly boring. The books I used as templates of Billy Connolly's autobiography and Peter Kay's autobiography. So that gives you an idea of a kind of style template. And I got their books, and they'd written about 100,000 words. I thought, let's see if I just write some stories down, what they look like. And I read a book a couple of years ago by Emily Maitlis, who's the BBC Newsnight presenter. She's written a book called Airhead. And apparently, the story is, I talked to her publisher. She didn't want to write the book. She was pressurised into it. So, I really don't want to do this. And she just wrote stories about interviews. So her book has a name at the top of the title, invariably. Prince Andrew is her last chapter. And she tells you all about the background to the interview and a lot of the stuff that went on. And I thought, I can do that. I don't have to do it chronologically. It's just like me and you having this conversation, ideally in a pub, by a fire, with a beer, and you go, when I was flying the Wessex, I go, oh, I flew the Wessex, and when I was flying the Sea King, and next thing you know, 2 hours has gone past and 3 pints is down.
Conversational,
we put the world to rights.
Conversational writing style is more engaging.
Conversational.
Well,
for pilots it is. I mean, I was reading a review by somebody today on Amazon and they clearly, I mean, they've done about 600 views on Amazon. Their average rating is 2.5 stars. And I got 2 stars from her, but she's not a pilot. She doesn't get it. She doesn't get the format at all. But my book, it's written, every chapter is standalone. You can leave it in the loo. You can have it by your bedside. You won't. It doesn't matter if you forget what happened in chapter 1 by the time you get to chapter 19. Because they're all
awesome.
remind you of
Chris, sorry, I missed what's it actually called?
Go.
Just Test Pilot. Yeah.
It's called Test Pilot. And then the subtitle is An Extraordinary Career Testing Civil Aircraft. So Test Pilot is the big title. The publishers were very keen to call it that. As I've mentioned earlier, there are some other very impressive test pilots out there that have written books called Test Pilot. And I wouldn't really want to put myself in their domain or whatever. But there is some sense in calling it Test Pilot because guess what? That's what I am. Brilliant. That's what I've been doing for 40 years.
We can revisit that towards the end. One of the questions I want to ask you is, what is the most difficult aircraft? One you may have flown, or 2 tested, or both?
S61 load. And the way the Americans did load lifting was you basically had a bubble window fitted to the left-hand seat. You sat in the left-hand seat rather than the usual right-hand seat, mainly so that you could put your head in the bubble window. You had a 100-foot plus long strop, and you had no air crewman, you had no ground crew. You basically just flew your S61 vertically over this load. There was an amateur bloke there that hooked it up, and then you flew it around and dropped it off. There was no assistance. So whilst the S61 is a stable aircraft, reasonably easy to fly, lifting a load off a 100-foot strop that weighs more than the helicopter, phenomenally difficult. Incredibly difficult to do it without embarrassment. Yeah. So that's one example of the airplane itself was okay, give or take. The task that it was being asked to do was challenging. I flew an awful lot, and I still do. I test autogyros. And one of the reasons I got asked to test autogyros for the CEA was their accident rate back then when I joined per flying hour was phenomenal. It was about 10 times the equivalent accident rate for almost every other type. So there's a bit of graph paper, one line's right at the top of the graph paper, and the other lines are all down the bottom. And they were just falling out of the sky, right, left and centre. So I learned how to fly gyros. I then went testing autogyros, and the most what's the word? The gyro that was killing most people was something called the RAF 2000. Mm-hmm. Now, some of your listeners may have flown the RAF 2000, and I flew with a good number of owners of RAF 2000s and pilots of RAF 2000s. Pilots of RAF 2000s are very good pilots.
Right.
It's a bit like Harrier pilots. I hate to admit it, but back in the day before it got easy, Harrier pilots were probably quite good pilots. So. I flew with the company test pilot out in Canada. He had 1,000 hours on the RF 2000 and had flown nothing else. So when I say to him, this is a desert, he goes, no, it's not. Because he's flown nothing else. He doesn't know anything else. But that was a helicopter that it broke all the rules for civil certification. It clearly didn't meet any normal civil standards for a safe aircraft to fly. We worked, really quite closely with the recreational organisations that looked after autogyros at the time, and the owners and people like that. And over a period, we managed to get the aircraft redesigned. We got a tail made. In fact, the guy that came up with this was a guy I know because he's a mate of my brother's. So it's a very small world. But he came up with a modification to the aircraft. And it made it better to fly. It made it better to fly to the point where I was then working for Civil Aviation Authority as a regulator, so I could say, it's not easy to fly, but it's acceptable. It's okay. It's safe. It's not fun necessarily, but it's safe. So I would count that as one of the more difficult aircraft. Again, if you read my book, I mention a Polish helicopter quite a lot. It's called the PZL SW4. It was basically designed by this company. The company, in previous years had built Soviet helicopters under license. That's what they'd done. Just before the wall came down, they'd started to think ahead because they could see the writing on the wall, and they decided to build effectively a scaled-down Squirrel helicopter. I mean, it looked a bit like a Squirrel helicopter that you just kind of shrunk on your CAD or something. Yeah. So, but it wasn't very nice to fly. It was underpowered. It had very poor handling qualities. It had very low rotor inertia, so it was very difficult to land following an engine failure. And I ended up doing several, week or 2 week sessions on that aircraft, culminating in 2 weeks in Arizona. As you will know, helicopters don't like thin air. They don't like high density altitudes. And we were doing engine off landings at 7,000, 9,000 feet, which is very marginal.
Yeah, would scare the life out of me.
This particular helicopter. It was that was scary stuff. Yeah, it was actually scary stuff. So I would cite those as probably amongst the more challenging aircraft I've had to deal with.
And I think in the snippet that I read in the book, or an excerpt from the book, you mentioned spinning. Something that has always kind of fascinated me a little bit and terrified me at the same time. Obviously, I've been subject when I did my PPL all the years ago. Spinning was still in the syllabus, and I was on the very first Tucano course, which involved inverted spinning, which was possibly one of the most frightening moments of my life. But do you have anything in particular to say about spinning in test flying? Because I'm guessing that there must be something about if you're testing an aircraft and have to spin it.
I've done a shed load of spinning. There's no doubt about it. Spin. I mean, I think I think I say in my book something along the lines of, aircraft that crash. If the engine hasn't stopped, or the pilot hasn't, done a sort of controlled flight into terrain due to poor weather. But, the third most sort of common cause of an aeroplane hitting the ground is because it's entered a spin, and which is a shame. And it often happens to pilots, on final or shortly after takeoff, where they're not yet in the groove. They might not be fully, aware of what's going on, and they spin to the ground. Civil certification wise, modern aeroplanes that we get into are all designed to have benign spin recovery characteristics, and that's what I've spent a lot of time doing. So I get invited to go and fly an aeroplane and enter a spin and see if I can recover. And having entered that spin and recovered, I do it again and again and again and again and again, for hours and hours and hours, because I do every single which way you can enter a spin, every single which way you can recover from a spin. I do it with all stages of flap, undercarriage up, undercarriage down, air brakes in, air brakes out, with power, with some power, with no power, etc. So a spinning spin test campaign can take days, and I do that for the aeroplanes that are cleared to spin. So I do that for aerobatic aeroplanes that are designed to be able to spin and recover from the spin. But I also have to do that for all the other airplanes out there that are designed not to.
That's the ones I'm interested in.
Those aeroplanes, even those aeroplanes might enter a spin by accident, because the pilot that's entered a spin by accident didn't know he was going to enter a spin. So all of the certification requirements are that those aircraft should recover from a single turn spin in a single further turn. So it's basically along the lines of a pilot gets too slow, something bad happens, the wing drops, it enters a spin. As long as he knows what to do, he should be able to recover that aeroplane within one further turn, and that should be it. And therefore, he should only lose 200, 300, 400 feet. Maybe certainly the microlights will only tend to lose that kind of height, and therefore, if it happens to him at 1,000 feet in the circuit, it's a survivable thing. Training is one aspect we perhaps shouldn't dwell on, but from my point of view of testing the aeroplane, I'm testing to make sure that aeroplane, in the right hands for somebody that knew what was going on, should be able to recover it. And again, I do it with power, without power, flaps, etc., etc., etc. And it is challenging. So one of the stories in my book is I did some microlights. If there's a certification requirement, and in the book, when he gets to spinning, it's almost like a sort of folksy kind of notes to mates, and everything else is done really well. And he gets to the spinning paragraph, and then he goes, microlights shouldn't be spun, basically. Yeah. But if you want to spin your microlight, contact the CEA. That's almost exactly what it's saying. And most people don't want to spin it. No. Why would you? But I'm an importer of the C42 back in the day. C42, nice little microlight, high wing, joystick in the middle, very popular with the training schools. Nice aeroplane, nothing wrong with it. But this guy goes, contact the CEA, we want to spin this aeroplane. Okay, fine. So off I go to spin this aeroplane. The first flight, I go and spin the aeroplane. I do all the right things, which basically means having entered the spin, you apply opposite rudder. You're trying to stop the yaw of the aeroplane. As I fed in rudder, this thing was going round. It was going round at, I don't know how many turns a second. I mean, it was going round like a spinning top. In my book, I think I talk about it like a tumble dryer. Yeah. It was going around fast. As soon as I put the rudder in, it stopped, bang, in an instant. I mean, it really went bang. Everything about the airframe went bang. And I thought, that's not good. I've never stopped a spin that quickly. Yeah. Most of the time, you're feeding the rudder, it wallows around a bit, and eventually it sorts itself out and you recover. This thing went bang. So I did it again. Same thing happened. I'm not happy with this. I go back down to the ground, talk to the guys on the ground, talk to their structural guy, and I go, so I've just done this. This is what happened. Is your airframe, is your aircraft strong enough to cope with these loads? And I look at this bloke, and this is a sort of an expression I've now seen scores of times. It's that sort of blank look, like you're staring into the abyss. You're not getting that positive vibe that you want to get, because what you want him to say is absolutely, it's fine. He goes, I don't know. Well, that's quite scary. Yeah. I think we talk about scary things. Quite often for me, I'm scared after the event when I realise potentially how close I was to, maybe not making it. But at the time, I'm too busy to give it too much thought. And this is one of those examples. So anyway, we lots of discussions with experts at the CEA, internal company experts. I didn't know at the time. Lots of people listening to this will know that aluminium bends in a kind of linear fashion. It's not like a composite that just snaps. Aluminium bends, and you by working out how much it's bent, you can work out how much load has been applied and how close it is to breaking. Okay. So what we did was we put cameras on the airplane. We went and did it all again. We saw exactly how much bending we'd introduced to the airframe, came back down, had it analysed by experts, and this thing was built like the proverbial. Okay. It was a very strong, well-made airframe, so that was fine. Great. Off we go again, back to spin. Most of the spinning went fine. Then I start to go through what we call the abuse cases. So now I'm spinning with an inadvertent amount of aileron or an inadvertent amount of this. Every time I did one of those spins, the engine stopped. So I'm flying along, spin, good dunk. And if some of your listeners have got a Rotax, Rotax doesn't stop like any other engine.
It stops like it's seized.
It stops like it's seized every single time. So, you go spin, good dunk. And it would just literally stop. The propeller would just stop in an instant. And you go, well, that's not clever. And the first time it happened, I point to where I parked my car. I'm in a glider again. Very used to gliding aeroplanes now. I had 17 plus engine failures, so I'm quite used to what to do. But the nice thing about the Rotax is, press the button, and each time this happened, it started. Mm-hmm. But it happened scores and scores of times. And then I was faced with, back at my desk at the CEA, going, yes, this aircraft recovers from a spin every time, but a lot of the time, the engine stops. Now, I'm used to that. I just deal with that. Can we certify for the general public an aeroplane where we know that most of the time the engine is going to stop? And guess what? The answer is no. We do not want a PPL holder going off on his own at 2,000 feet, finding he hasn't got an engine, because the CEA said it was safe. So we had to say, I'm terribly sorry, but we're not going to clear this airplane spin. which was a shame, but it was the right.
Sounds reasonable to me. Yeah, a C-42. I'm not sure if I want to spin one anyway, despite your wholesome testing. I think.
But they're okay. I have a lot of time for the C-42, and I did some testing of the latest version only last year out in Norfolk, and I wouldn't want to deter people from the C-42. If I'm a normal spin recovery, if I'm a one-turn spin, it recovered every single time. I would consider it quite a safe.
And this is people doing intentional spinning as well, because the likelihood is, as you said, I think at the start, that most people who store incipient spin do it at fairly low level, and it's a little bit inconsequential whether the engine's stopped or not really in that situation. So it's amazing. It's really interesting, and you imagine spinning, as you say, aerobatic aircraft, stuff that is designed to spin, but it's a whole different kettle of fish when you're in stuff. When you look at a microlight and go, right, I'm going to spin this. To me, that's where you earn your money, Chris.
Well, and I do all the right things. I wear a parachute, I wear my helmet, and I try and make sure that I'm going to be able to get the door open, which is a challenge, as you can imagine, because when you're going round and round in circles, if you can't get out of the aeroplane, there's no point in having a parachute on your back. You're stuck there. So, I mentioned in the book that I did fly a microlight where it took a long time to come out of the spin. And I was starting to think about at what point do I need to jump out. But it did come good in the end.
That's really good. And do you fly for fun at all now?
Well, I have a share in a Eurostar Microlight. I have a small share in that, and I bought that predominantly to be able to fly myself to work, because obviously most of my work is at other airfields, invariably GA airfields. And unfortunately, my local airfield closed, so it's not quite as convenient. And I have flown my children in it. I've flown my wife in it. It's a nice little aeroplane. The problem I have, and I mentioned this in the book, I am, because of the nature of the job I have, I'm constantly thinking of the worst possible scenario.
I'm not sure if that's just been a test pilot, though. I think that's probably something to do with a helicopter pilot as well, because I've spoken about this before. I think we're all quite pessimists when it comes to that, because
I think so.
Helicopter flying is quite often sitting there waiting for it to go wrong. I mean, not so much. It is not so much these days, but certainly the thing I still fly, incredibly and reliable, and it doesn't miss a beat. But I was certainly in my early days, I think most helicopter pilots, I think there's cartoons about it, isn't there? Helicopter pilots are just sitting there waiting for something to happen. If it hasn't happened, it's about to.
I must stop saying it. I say in my book, but I say one of the jobs I ended up doing was test flying a Spitfire.
Wow!
It was a 2-seat Spitfire. I was flying it with another guy, and I don't know about you, but I talk about those hairs on the back of my neck, because I think helicopter pilots get those hairs on the back of the neck very finely tuned to be a clue that something's
normally a
not
noise,
right. And it's just you just feel that something's not right. And we were diving the Spitfire. I was flying. The guy in the front was telling me to go faster. We had to reach a certain speed, and those hairs on the back of my neck were going. There's something not right about this. And to cut a long story short, I knocked it off. We went back to the airfield we started from. I got a lot of grief from the other pilot, the engineers. It turns out there was a faulty pressure error system. We were flying a lot faster than the airspeed indicator said. We would have ripped the wings off. There is no doubt. Had we carried on to the published speed, we would have done the aircraft a lot of damage, and we may not have walked home. So, so helicopter pilots are like that. And I think if you're doing flight tests, we spend a lot of our time. I'm always looking for fields to land on. Always. When I'm flying along. If I'm flying at 2,000 feet, I'm wondering why I'm not at 3. If I'm at 3, why am I not at 5? Am I in the best possible height, environment, speed to cope with the engine failure or whatever else might be? Which means that it does take a tinge of fun away, But on the other hand, I'm still here to tell the tale. It's a
funny. I totally get that, because I went back to fixed wing flying. I can't remember how many years ago now, but whatever it was, 5 or 6 years ago, and I fly my own little aircraft, and my attitude is really different to a lot of the PPL flyers who I think have far more fun than I do, because I fly a little single seat aircraft. It's high performance. It's a tail wheel, so it's a great little aircraft, and it's not that difficult to fly, but it does have little traps, and particularly the landing. Your whole flight is based, and like any tail wheel, is based around what you're going to do at the end.
And knowing if you're going to be able to
well, the last time was just luck. But that it really resonates with me with that, because I fly and I'm constantly thinking, what happens if the engine stops? What happens? I've written a small ebook about it, actually, which I kind of give away, and I call it the doubt monster, because I always say that there's someone on my shoulder. It's the doubt monster, is when the engine's going to stop. It's not if it's going to stop. It's just when it will. That moment will happen. And I think I speak to friends and mates that I fly with, have not come from a similar background. And they go, no, I don't really worry about that at all. I'll deal with it. I'll deal with it when it comes. I'm totally different.
But it's too late. It's too late. I'm not good enough. I'm not competent enough to just deal with the scenario thrown at me completely without any warning at all. So if you just fly me around in a blindfold, take the blindfold off with an engine failure and go pick a field, I'll dither.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I'll go, I don't know. Oh, there's a yellow one there, there's a green one, a brown one. Oh, brown's muddy. Oh, yellow's red.
Choice.
That's bad. Is green better than brown? You know what I mean? So instead, I spend most of my time, not all the time. I'm checking the temperature and pressures every now and again and the fuel gauges, but every now and again, I just look around my environment and go, where's the wind? Where would I go if the engine stopped now? Which field would I land in? And I've had a lot of engine failures, lots and lots, and lots in autogyros, and I've still been caught out. But generally speaking, up until now, when an engine has failed, I've already got an idea of what I'm going to do next. Otherwise, I've got 8,000 flying hours, 40 odd years of flying experience. I still couldn't cope with just being, doorstep with a new scenario, because it's too difficult, isn't it? I mean, it's just too, I think if you're not preempting and planning a little bit ahead, you could get caught.
It's really good advice, Chris. It is really good advice, and it shouldn't spoil your flying, but it is excellent advice. And particularly, up here where I live, up in Scotland, there aren't a lot of flat places either, and people forget that. If you fly in Norfolk, when I've taken my aircraft down there, and you go, I'm having the same thoughts, and as you said, you're spoilt for choice. Do I go for the yellow rape field, or do I go for the brown field, or do I go for the green field? I won't select that one because it's got wires in. But because up here, quite a lot of the time, it's a calculated risk. We fly over the mountains to get to places, and you're looking in valley bottoms, and thinking, or looking at that lock, thinking, how cold is that going to be? Those were my thoughts generally. If I survive the ditching, am I just going to die of hypothermia straight away? Especially coming from a search and rescue background. But it's really, really good advice. And as you say, there's a test pilot. You've got some ideas. There's a test pilot telling us that say, you don't want the surprise. You don't have even a test pilot's not going to have the skills to suddenly go, right, I've not even thought about this, and here it's happening to me. It's good stuff. So one of the ones I wanted to ask you, I've asked you which one scared you the most, which one worried you the most, and we've talked about spinning and all the difficult things. Do you have a favourite?
Well, I just started putting some of these question and answers on my book's Pen and Sword, and they've got a blog. I don't know what a blog is, if I'm honest, I'm the wrong age, but apparently there's a blog with my name on it. And the question I answered last week was, what is my favourite helicopter? Mm-hmm. And the question I'm going to answer next week is, what are my
I don't want to spoil it then.
Because I sort of split. Yeah. I thought I'd better split the two out. And for helicopters, what I said was, we've talked a lot about the Wasp and Lynx. So, most military pilots, generally speaking, I think your first operational type always has a sort of soft place in your heart, doesn't it? And in fact, when I was working for the CEA, I tested through a number of WASP helicopters again. I realised as a test pilot flying the WASP how bloody difficult it actually was to fly. And I was kind of awestruck about my sort of 20-something self that used to fly that same helicopter on dark, stormy, crappy nights onto the back of
ignorance is bliss, Chris.
I mean, a very demanding task.
Ignorance is bliss, and there's a lot of
it was. Absolutely.
There's a lot of 20. There's a lot of 20-somethings that have done similar things, and then, as you say, you look back and you go, "Did we really do that?" Yeah.
Absolutely.
But you are immortal when you're 20, so it's fine.
It's a difficult aircraft to fly, poor instruments, poor props, and obviously the Lynx, as I've already said, very capable in comparison. Couple of other types that are worth mentioning. I think in some ways the most awesome helicopter I've had the privilege to fly was the twin-engine Cobra, the Whiskey Cobra, AH-1W Cobra. I flew that out in the States at the test pilot school there, did an assessment of it, 190 knots, pretending to be a Vietnam pilot, firing my rockets and all that stuff. I mean, really, that was a lot of fun. There's no doubt about it. It was a real blast to do that. So I think that probably counts as one of the more awesome aircraft. CH-53, just massive amounts of power. Again, in almost carefree handling at lightweight. And it's got, it can carry more than a Chinook, I think. That's pretty awesome. I really quite like flying the Jet Ranger. I'm still qualified on the Jet Ranger now. I teach on it, examine on it. And the Jet Ranger is one of those aircraft. I call it a low gain aircraft. You have to sort of sit in it, pretend you're smoking weed, really chilled out. There's absolutely no point in thrashing the controls around.
For my podcast sake, please don't do that, of course.
No, don't smoke weed and then go flying. But it's a sort of low gain, chilled out airplane. You can't do anything aggressively. But if you look at all the movies with helicopters in, 90% of them feature a Jet Ranger. Yeah. It's all about it. Fly around in them, and it's actually it does everything a helicopter can do. And if you're going to have an engine failure in a helicopter, a Jet Ranger is not a bad one to do. It's got very good inertia. It's very easy to do an engine off landing. But ironically, for me, and I think we share this, the aircraft the helicopter I say is my favourite is the Wessex. And I missed my chance to fly the Wessex as a Navy pilot proper, because when I got my wings, there was a little list came out and it said, "What do you want to fly?" And of course said the Wasp. And I was lucky enough to get the one slot. My second choice was Wessex. But by the time I'd finished flying the Wasp, the Navy had pensioned off the Wessex, which was very sad. But fortunately for me, RAE Bedford and Boscombe Down each had a Wessex helicopter. One was an Air Force Mark II, one was a Navy Mark V, and I found myself the Wessex expert. I was the last project pilot for the Wessex. And I loved the Wessex. I mean, I loved its undercarriage, I loved its big wheels, I loved the ability to plonk it on the ground using the tail wheel first. I loved the fact that it basically it only needed one engine and they gave you two. You could fly around on one engine and hardly notice that you'd missed the second one. A lovely big collector lever with a nice wooden handle on the end of it.
It's the piece of wood in the Wessex.
That massive sliding door, didn't it? Yeah, it's massive sliding door, so you could lean out, get some fresh air. And I did some really interesting trials in the Wessex. I ended up landing on the back of a Type 23 frigate in some very nasty weather. The Wessex barely fits on a frigate. It's the wrong size. The tail wheel's down the back. The gearbox is a long way forward, so it's actually quite a long helicopter. But I think the Wessex is a lot of fun to fly. So I decided ultimately that's my favourite. When it comes to aeroplanes, that's what I'm going to write next week. But
please don't give anything away for your publisher. I don't want to get in trouble.
Well, I'm working out what it's going to be. I have a soft spot for the Hawk. I flew the Hawk a few times, as you know, at Boscombe. I thought it was just lovely to be up at 30,000 feet above all the cloud. Doing what the Red Arrows do. I mean, it's just a nice, fun aeroplane, really. Easy to fly, I think. Difficult to keep straight on the ground, but easy to fly. I liked flying the Chipmunk. That's definitely one of my favourites. I did a lot of Chipmunk time during university, flying Navy Chipmunks, took them to France, pretending to be a Typhoon pilot, flying between trees in the south of France. A lot of fun. Chipmunk's a little fighter airplane. I had a chance to fly the Sea Fury. that was a huge amount of fun. It flew a lot like the Chipmunk on steroids. And obviously for a Fleet Air Arm pilot, for me, that was, the Swordfish and the Sea Fury are possibly the Navy's most iconic aircraft types. So I'm dithering over which is my favourite, but I've got a short list of half a dozen for sure.
We will in the show notes, we'll put a link to the blog so people can find out which one it is.
Okay.
So my last question that I ask everybody, and you can answer this any which way you like, it doesn't have to be in aviation terms, it can be in a world view, is what do you think the world will look like in 5 years' time?
Yeah, I mean, I saw that on your proposed list of questions, and I thought maybe we run out of time before we get to that.
No.
One. I think it's a phenomenally difficult question. I mean, who knew? If you'd asked that question 5 years ago, who knew what we as a world would have gone through? I mean, climate change. That in the last 5 years there's been a massive acceptance of that. But obviously COVID and then the war in Europe, Ukraine. I mean, you would never really have guessed 5 years ago, would you, that Russia would invade you?
Yeah.
I mean, it just seemed nonsensical in 2022 to be, restarting World War II. It just seems absolutely crazy. I don't know what the next 5 years looks like. I think the world is going to... I don't think a lot of people in the world have... the penny hasn't dropped. I mean, it's the council elections today as we're filming this. A lot of media is saying people are upset about the cost of living in the hope that Boris Johnson and the cabinet have got a magic wand. There is no money. There is the money from the UK was all spent on COVID, and everybody thought that was a good idea at the time. We borrowed incredibly, and the interest rates are now going up. So, not only do we owe a lot of money, servicing the debt is going to take up whatever spare cash we've got. I think the other parties, politicians who have got glib answers, really aren't being truthful. I think it's going to be very tough. And, we as a nation have to be very cognizant and supportive of, those in Germany that will not have enough gas for their industry and their heating. Because if we don't stop buying Russian gas, that's not going to be good. So it's a really different world now to even 3 months ago, 4 months ago.
And I think and it's a good answer, Chris, and without delving too deep into politics, because I think we all see enough of that. But I feel for our kids, I feel for our teenagers. Every generation says, we had the best of it. I think at the moment for them, and I look at it from an aviation point of view, so I'm very keen on getting youngsters into aviation. That it's not an easy world to be living in. Some of it is, but the other parts are not. And I think in the next 5 years, as you said, it will be fascinating to see how that turns out. And I think our kids need to be extra resilient to get through it. And that's the stuff that we're at the other end. Hopefully we're not close to the pushing up the daisies, but it's our kids that I really feel for. And in terms of aviation, again as well, we've discussed your fantastic background. I was incredibly lucky, and luck does come into this a lot as well, and the opportunities that were presented to us, and with no guilt. There was no guilt. There was no guilt about burning thousands of gallons of Jet A1 and avgas. There was no worry about no one was worried about climate change or the planet or what the potential consequences of what we did were. So it's really interesting.
It's a different world.
Chris,
and you're absolutely
Chris,
right.
it's been fascinating. Give me one more reminder. The book is called Test Pilot, and the subtitle
Test Pilot: An Extraordinary Career Testing Civil Aircraft. It's available all the usual outlets: Amazon, Waterstone, Smiths, Pen and Sword publish it. You can get it from there, but it's £18 on Amazon's. Leave me a 5-star review.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll put it in the show notes. And thank you so much. It's been really fascinating, and I think as well, I'd like to get you back on, perhaps for the third book, because I think there's so many more stories there to tell.
Oh, there's lots more to talk about.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks go to Chris for such an interesting and informative dive into the world of both military and civilian test flying. Chris's book is now available to buy on Amazon, and at other outlets. We've put some links in the show notes to help you go grab your copy. If you or your business would like to appear on the Busy Aviation podcast, please do get in touch through our website, which can be found at www.busyaviation.co.uk. You'll also find our latest news, articles, and other episodes of this podcast. Please take a moment to sign up for our newsletter, and in the meantime, safe flying and happy landings.